Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Before you on the podium, we have Dr. Yahya Zubair, Dr. Rashid Limsani, and Dr. Tahir Kilavus. This session will be talking about the case of Algeria. And for this session, we have Fadi Az-Za'tari. He will chair this session. Fadi is a senior research associate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs here at SIGA. And he is also a lecturer at the Department of Political Science here at Istanbul Sabah ad-Din Zaim University. Mr. Fadi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Miqdad. Can you please close the door there because it makes noise? Thank you, Dr. Miqdad. Thank you, Dr. Sami. Thank you, Dr. Sami, also for putting the structure for all of this program. Today we will move from Pakistan to the case of Algeria. Hopefully we will have more friendly discussion. So we have three distinguished scholars. We will start with Dr. Yahya Zubair, who will talk about the role of military in Algerian domestic and foreign policy. Professor Zubair, he is senior professor of international studies, and he has experience in many different countries and universities, including Europe, United States, India, Indonesia, South Korea, Middle East, North Africa. He wrote many books and articles on this issue. Our second speaker will be Dr. Rashid Limsani, who has experience of teaching almost 4 decades at the political science and world politics at University of Algeria. He received his PhD from Boston University, and then after that he came back to Algeria and was teaching in the political science. He also has experience at Harvard University, European University Institute in Florence in Italy, and also in Georgetown University and many other universities in Sweden also. And he will be talking about the civil-military relations and the political economy of military intervention. That will be followed by Dr. Tahir Kilavus, who finished his PhD in political science from University of Notre Dame. He holds also master from Koç University and BA from Istanbul Bilgi University. He's doing his postdoctor in Harvard University in America, and he will be talking about the continuity and change of the Algerian regime and civil-military relations. So we will start, please, with Dr. Yahya. Please, the floor is yours. We will have for every talk 18 to 20 minutes, and after that we will be following question and answer.
Assalamu alaikum. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Sami Al-Arian for the invitation, and Imad Atwi for his correspondence and keeping on top of things before my trip here. I surprised my two colleagues this morning. I told them I am going to talk maybe a little bit more seriously because Algeria is so little known in many Middle East studies. And I thought maybe it would be good to give a background, a historical background on the issues and how this happened. Because I am a firm believer that if you do not understand the history of Algeria, you cannot understand what is going on today, including the recent, the Iraq and so on and so forth, because of what happened in the 1950s during the revolution. Of course, the main question that relates to Algeria is who really governs in Algeria? And decidedly, it is the military. But the military has one particularity in the case of Algeria. It never likes to be seen in the forefront. Until today, when it is face-to-face, it's naked. The military is naked today. In other words, its power has appeared in the forefront. In the past, it's always behind the scenes. And that is new. It's with the Iraq, it is new. So it's the real the holder of power. what I start with usually is there was a Congress during the revolution, because the revolution, the armed struggle against French colonialism, and that's a little reminiscent of what happened to Egypt when I was listening to my colleagues talking about Egypt yesterday. But in the case of Algeria, it was sort of militias and so on and so forth, and some of the leaders of the revolution became aware that you needed to prepare for the post-war, the type of state that Algeria needed. And there were 2 points that were made, and this is the reference to that Congress in 1956, and it's still, referred to by the nationalists, by the protest movement today. One of which was the primacy of civilians over military. That was a key concept at the time. The second one was the primacy of the military, the fighters within the country, against the ones who were at the borders, beyond the borders, that is in Morocco and Tunisia. These 2 are key in understanding what happened. But of course, as of 1957 already, the role of the army and the security services, the so-called MALG, the ones who were in charge of getting weapons and so on, but it was the forefather of the intelligence services, up to today. They call them the Malgache, So they became more pronounced. Their role was more pronounced, and you know that by the 1960s, the narrative, which is probably valid today, and when I heard about Pakistan, they have the same narrative. That is, democracy won't work. One of the premises was, if we had democracy or democratic activities, we would not have had a revolution. We would not have had a war of liberation. So we would not have had the insurrection. Okay, that was a very important part of the narrative of the military. So this is what explains the seizure of power in 1962. That is that independence. So in independence, there was this sort of the bargain between the first president of Algeria and the military. And he was sort of the civilian at the forefront, when in fact the military was working behind the scenes, especially with his minister of defense. So since then, the military has played the leading political role in Algeria. So, but at no time, I underline this point, Algerian officers assumed political power as military personnel. There's not political power. Yes, there were some with, civilian clothing, or they were heads of companies and so on and so forth, or national corporations, but they were presented as civilians. This is quite important. So they either allied with civilians, civilian figures, or they swapped their uniforms, at the very moment they entered political office. The political history, and this is where I present my main point, in the sense that if we want to understand, because if we go through the whole itinerary of this military-civilian relations, and I know you're going to talk more into the technical aspects if you wish, there are 3 centers of power in the Algerian system: the presidency, the military command, and the intelligence services. And so there has always been this kind of dynamic at play between these 3 elements. So the whole history of post-independent Algeria is one of a balancing act of solidarity and competition among these 3 centers of power. So you'll see throughout history, when I was preparing for this and looking at the entire history of Algeria, first president, second president, and so on and so forth, you see this at times, the balance shifts in favor of one or the other. And right now, they're trying, the current chief of staff, the head of the chiefs of staff, who has disappeared from the scene in the last few days, but is trying to put back, the high command in control against the intelligence services. But they never go, it never happened that they would go full speed against one another. So I know I will be talking too much, so I have to be more selective. From the beginning, though, the system, in my view, was doomed to fail because basically there was no sense of democratic legitimacy. The whole system was based on the legitimacy of the War of Liberation, which they had exhausted. Personally, in my writings, I say that the legitimacy of the system, or at least the successive regimes, had basically evaporated by 1986, 88. It was over. So they tried to maintain it under Bouteflika, but it's only, it had already eroded. So there was pluralism within this evolution of the civilian-military relations was tolerated within an undemocratic framework. You remember, if you know of the work of Tahir here present, he talked, we were in the same line, how the regime was always able to rejuvenate itself through a toolkit, having ways of solving, how to survive. And right now they are in big crisis. They don't know how to survive, including trying to sell out, the oil fields and other things to stay in power. In any case, if you look at the military power as such under Boumediene through the first coup in 1965, Boumediene had one advantage over all the others. He did not have legitimacy. He was a very, how should I put it, lacked charisma in the beginning, had no real legitimacy, but he was the head of the military command, and he was able to marginalize from the pre-independence period, the provisional government of the Republic of Algeria, GPRA. So he was able to do that. However, he could not seize power as a military man. That's very important to know, because even within military circles, he was not very well known. And he came from the outside with a group to which Bouteflika belonged, which is known as the Oujda group at the time. So he formed an alliance with the first president, only to overthrow him later on. Made him believe that it's the FLN, the civilians who were in control. In Algeria, there was always this fallacy that it was the FLN, the National Liberation Front, that was basically the real decision maker. The military never showed that it was the real decision maker. It was the FLN in essence. In fact, you understand that when you see, whenever there is a rebellion, it's always targeted against the FLN. In 1988, it was the FLN that was targeted, and even today, it was the FLN that was targeted, not the military. The military is hawa, brothers and brothers, Of course, I could, in the Q&A, I can tell you about how this came about, because there is a sense among the population that the military is really the guardian of the state, of the protector. In fact, if you look at the Arab barometer, 70% of the Algerians believe in the military. Well, it's a peculiar situation because the military in Algeria is, it's different from Egypt. In that sense, there is a big difference with Egypt. It's a people's army that everybody claims. It's the, if you wish, it's the successor of the National Liberation Army. So it became the National Popular Army. But nothing changed in terms of the structure, except at times the professionalization of the military. What Boumediene did, for instance, was to to professionalize the high command, did not want it to be politicized, unlike him, who was quite politicized. So, in any case, I'm going to skip a little bit so that I can keep track of the time. So, the three configuration I talked about, the power structure was maintained from 65 to 78. What did Boumediene do? And I served in the Algerian military as a conscript. The whole time, the constitution always gave a place, until then, the military was part of the construction of the country, the development of the country, and the military was supposed to protect the socialist development of Algeria. So there was a vision, whether we agree or not, but there was a sort of vision, and the high command supported that vision, and so did the intelligence services. This is important because you'll see there will be a shift later on under Shadley. But they supported him. He was charismatic. There was a sort of consensus. And those who were opposed to his policies, eventually, under Shadley, found the real, the free ground to express their own opinions. And, there was a quasi-liberalization, in quotation marks, of the system, mainly a liberalization in the economic sector, which I call the botched liberalization, but it meant really a more obvious redistribution of the rent to the military officers and so on, the high military officers, and with the introduction of including the introduction of the rank of general and so on and so forth in the 80s. So what was the role of the military? The military under Boumediene and even under Shadley, it was political repression. It was political repression, and so the system was based on violence, on political violence. They assassinated, opponents, including opponents from the War of Liberation. They killed, Krim, they killed Khidr, they killed, they did that. So, but Boumediene had a sort of socio-economic project of modernization and so on and so forth. So, we don't know. Today, the question is, what would have happened if Boumediene had not died prematurely? Would the system have remained coherent with the vision towards the socialist direction or not? We don't know. He died, and that was it. So it was the disappearance. This is what I'm trying to say. With his death, it was the whole system, the whole project, the whole socio-economic project that changed. He has written enough, your book on the bazaar economy, which was born basically under Shadli Ben Jadid. So, and at that, what you notice after Boumediene's death, you see the reemergence of the party to play a certain role. But the reality is the intelligence services were the ones who had penetrated every aspect of society, including the universities. You had, and the nomination of diplomats, what have you, the intelligence services had taken a more prominent role. So basically, when Shadli came to power, he too was not very charismatic, and in fact, he looked very malleable by the by the intelligence services. So yeah, 5 minutes, that's not a lot. So all right. So, in any case, to make a story short regarding the Shadli era, even under Shadli, you had this kind of reformers, if you wish. There was some sort of liberal thinking that was emerging. And so, the intelligence services were used as the interface with the military command. These were they allowed the intelligence services to play a certain role until like the 80s, when the power shift began to try to eliminate, or at least to reduce, the power of the intelligence services. And that was the restructuring of the intelligence services from the SM, and there was this restructuring and so on and so forth. So basically, what happened though is that, now we entered under Shadli, that's my argument, we entered this rent seeking and rent redistribution to the military, yet with some professionalization. There was a movement towards professionalizing the army. But at the same time, there was an exclusion of the opposition groups. They were either reduced, or so on, and then the regime played one force against the other. One time it was the left, but under Shadli, it was more the Islamists that they played against. And you see there was an emergence, within the system itself. This was, we have to look at what's going on within the society. You cannot just focus on the military and the civil. You have to focus on what is going on in the society, and you had different forces that emerge. Radical left, radical Islamists, Salafi Islamists, and there was no room for the moderate Islamists. They were somewhat marginalized. And there were those who wanted a sort of balance. In other words, it was under Zerwal, what we called les conciliateurs, the ones who were with some sort of reconciliation to take, the various, you cannot eliminate the Islamists. You cannot eliminate the Islamist threat through security measures only. So that was the reconciliation that started with Zerwal and then was taken up by Bouteflika. Bouteflika agreed with that. What did Bouteflika do? I'm going to try to go faster, in the sense that after the events of 1988, the riots of 1988, the system once again tried to find a formula, but of course they were within the military. It would be a mistake to ignore the fact that within the military there was a competition among different visions. Some were a little bit more liberal and so on and so forth, like others. And of course, with the rise of terrorism, with this all changed afterward. So in a sense, before, in the period 1989, 1991, 92, you could see there was a semblance of agreement to allow maybe some sort of transition. Towards what? We don't know. I called it the perpetual transition, and it stayed until today. It's a perpetual transition. But what was clear was the shift in sort of the economic orientation of the country, which became more liberal. And again, I'm talking about botched liberalism. It was not, like a clear-cut capitalism and so on and so forth. And so under Bouteflika, it's the perversion of the regime, the true perversion. Bouteflika initially, and I know he will talk more about this, Bouteflika used the high command first, or rather, it was relying on the intelligence services, mostly on the intelligence services, until 2013, I would say. And then it was the high command again, to eliminate part of the intelligence services. So he told me I have 2 minutes left, so I cannot go for too long to explain, but during the Q&A, I will have more. So what happened today, currently, the whole question was how to limit the power of the intelligence services. That was Bouteflika. His plan was all along, my argument, all along wanted to eliminate both the high command, to neutralize both the high command and eventually the intelligence services. So he used one against the other. You remember the three that I was talking about, to strengthen the presidency. Of course, he had used the illiterate current head of chiefs of staff, gave him the power. Of course, this guy has taken over the intelligence, or he thinks he has taken the intelligence to his side. But then when he felt that he was going to be eliminated himself, then he turned against his former allies. And now we have a military that, without a clear vision, we have a high command that doesn't know where it is going. This is, again, my 2 cents in all this. So he had this loyalty. Now there's no loyalty, and he is the all-powerful man in illegitimate government. And he himself is in the illegality, complete illegality, claiming that he's following the Constitution when he's not. So today, the hope that we have in Algeria is, the protest movement is calling for a civilian state, the end of a military regime. That is, they say, we do not want a military state. So that's where we are. Basically, we have to take into account, all of us, I'm sure the three of us here, are in agreement regarding the existence of a deep state in Algeria. And so, since I was asked, give me 1 extra minute, since I was asked to talk about foreign policy foreign policy was always almost either the prerogative of the presidency, but the military also had its own lines. Under Boumediene, it was the third world, focused on the third world, and so on and so forth. Under Bouteflika, we had almost nothing. But at the same time, they took advantage, the regime took advantage of 2001, the 9/11, to build its new legitimacy internationally on the war, the anti-terrorist war. And this is why, up to today, the Europeans, the Americans, and others are in a sort of bind because they don't know how to act, because Algeria put itself or became sort of pivot in the region in the fight against terrorism. And they had capitalized on that. But right now, with this Iraq, and what is going on, it has weakened this legitimacy. Luckily for the regime, right now, the people are separating Gaid Saleh from the ANP and the High Command. So I don't know for how long it's going to continue, but there is a struggle today between trying to maintain the old system and the ones who want to do completely away with the old system. And that is what the people are calling for. This is why there is guarded optimism regarding the pressure that the protest movement is putting on the system to say, you've got to go, تتنحوا قاع. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yahya Zubair. We will move now for the second speech, Dr. Rashid Telmsani. Of course, the economic aspect in relation to military is very important, so he will be elaborating more on this topic, please.
Thank you. It would be very hard to talk after my friend in speech. I find very, very analytical paper, and really I like it. I scheduled to talk on 5 main points. The national movement and the rise of the army during the revolution, that's the first. The second, the rise of the army has an hegemonic group at the independence. The third will be the rise of Abdelaziz Bouteflika as president and the role of oil economy. The fourth will be, the Iraq has a new social movement, not only in Algeria, I would say in the whole area. I think the future will be based on this young movement. We'll see its main features. And the fifth point would be, I think, more theoretical. I would say we are witnessing, the crisis of the security state, not the crisis of nation state, to use a secularist word of Ummah crisis. I think we are witnessing, the deep crisis of security state. And that's my main conclusion, which will be very, very theoretical. To start with, I think I have to recall some facts. I have to be at least a little bit narrative, because we have a lot of students here. The Algerian struggle against colonial rule started in '54. From the very beginning, we have kind of confusion between the political wing and the army, the liberation movement. At the first meeting of the liberation, which took place, 2 years later in '56, as Zubair mentioned, they decided one crucial idea. At least two, but in this regard, I have to mention just one: the prevalence of the political issue over military issues. That is, it was, very strong idea. But the rise of I would say, the colonial, rule, started to have, to direct the armed struggle and the revolution. We have a lot, during this war, liberation, we have, a lot of groupings, fights and for leadership and so on, But by the end of the independence, we have already a new group. We call l'Armée des Frontières. It was the military groups that stand on the borders in Tunisia and in Morocco. They were well-equipped, well-trained, and they were not involved in the struggle. They were just sitting and having a good time. Okay, but with the independence, they make a move to take over the city. And as we know, in the third world, everything is around city because we have, the televisions, we have the radio, we have and it was, they made, the first putsch, 62. They put away the civilian authority. We have civilian authority, we call the provisional, government, which has, based abroad, kind of government, but it was supposed to take over when the French will leave, but the military took over. Then in 65, we have a second military coup. The Boumediene took over. They took the elected president, very well known at the time. His name is Ben Bella, very populist, blah, 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 blah. He put away. And Boumediene installed very crude and rude and harsh military bases. He started. 2 years later, he had a coup from another colonel, 67, but the coup failed. From this time, I think the military group under Colonel, Houari Boumediene get, the upper hand of the rule, of the command. And he start to develop what we call, the Mukhabarat, intelligence service. He started, to take, all means, to grow up. And he had, the upper hand, which is very important during this rule. He had, upper hand on the army, regular army, the classical army, and the Mukhabarat. And during this time, as my friend Zubair mentioned, it was very military rule, dictatorship, blah, 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 no freedom of speech or speech. But, at this time, it had, what we call, economic, positive things, it built, with a very strong material basis. I think it was unique, I think, in Arab state. We have, cases like in Egypt and Syria that have, this kind of economic base very, very strong. But the problem with this economic base, it was imported machines, equipment. We don't have, the brain, the know-how to take over. So in 88, we have, riots. We have big riots. Meanwhile, we have new government, blah, blah, blah. We have, but the main issue, why? Because in 86, the price of oil fell down. It reached, at $6 barrel. So it was kind of almost famine in Algeria. At the same time, we have, within the upper, elite, we have, struggles. So we have, riots. Bon, we don't have the problem with these riots. We don't have really empirical data. We have only journalistic, studies. But by now, I think we can say, we have, two groups within the army that, initiated or manipulated these riots. We call reformists, one, reformist, the other one, have you socialist, conservative, or whatever. But the riots, took almost across the country. But when the riot got its own, I would say, inner logic of independence, it was stopped. So the riot, lasted, 5 or 6 days. And then we have, we launched, the government launched, reform, economic reform, we call it liberalization, political and economic liberalization. One of the crucial issues on political sphere was, democratization. We put a law on democratization. But the problem with democratization, it was controlled by the Mukhabarat. I think all the parties, all the NGOs, it was the hand of Mukhabarat was somewhere over there. And that's the reason why myself, I don't call it, revolution or what. It's what kind of manipulation. For sure, at the economic level, situation was revolutionary. It was, the rate of unemployment was very, very high. The factories didn't open; they were closed. We have a really economic crisis. But the power, he has said, has rejuvenate itself. It has put new levels to govern. It was democratization. Well, all of a sudden we have 45 parties, 60 parties, 30 or 40 newspaper. All of them were financed by the state, which was good. Let me tell you, which was good. We have kind of freedom of speech. It was really unique in the free, because it was power struggles. With these power struggles, every group has one or two newspapers. So we have a lot. We have a lot of data information what is going on. So we can publish. You publish, but the problem it can be utilized by another group. But that is a risk when you publish. But we have, I would say, a lot. On observators abroad. Say, it was in Algeria. The first continental third world that we have, really freedom of press. I think it was unique. So then at the same time, one crucial issue on the liberalization, political liberalization, we have, the Islamists. The government gave, the authority of Islamists, to get involved with political history, although it was against the law. That's another contradictions. The Islamists, according to the law, were not authorized to have parties. But for power struggles, they were allowed to organize themselves. Of course, within this crisis, meanwhile we have FME adjustment structural, they closed a lot of factories. The situation was really terrible. So any party under this situation, under this condition, that make promises, you have paradise. I will get you a job. The young, you are married. You are single. I will marry you. I give you a house. I give you money, and so on. So people, voted for the fees. But the ruling group, the military group, didn't have this kind of scenario. That's too much. The social dynamic is going very, very far. They stopped it. They stopped the second round of election. So we have, a new conflict dynamic. We call, civil war or whatever. Myself, I refuse the term of civil war. For me, I think it is armed conflict between two military groups. Finally, it lasted, 10 years or whatever. It was, socially speaking, very, very terrible, even economically speaking. I know the loss in Algeria lost around 30 billions, economically speaking, during this period of time. And now there is agreement, consensus that more than 200,000 people disappeared during this civil war. I mean, in other words, the social cost was really, really, really heavy until now. This issue is not opened. Scholars, intellectuals don't open, but because it is very profound in our heart. I think it was like during the armed struggle. In every family, we have one or two persons disappeared during this civil war. So we have in '89. 89, we have new election, democratic elections, or people are the ruling military called Bouteflika to save the country. In 99, April 99. And they organized, on elections, which was really good for this election. For the first time, we have, free election. We have, 7 candidates, and from different political stripes. It was really fantastic, It was the first time we have a really campaign, like in Western society. But in the last minute, that's surprising. 6 candidates withdrew from the race because they were aware that there is fraud. The Bouteflika find himself, and he was elected, of course. Us. So, and he was elected first time, blah blah blah, until 4th time. Meanwhile, what is good, it had a lot of money, because the oil, went up until over $100 a barrel. So instead of putting this money to develop the country, they put it to buy, social peace. He corrupted, I would say, everybody. He corrupted and he stayed in power 20 years. But on the eve of the 5th election, people said, that's too much. Meanwhile, he was really, really sick. He can't move, he can't talk. Even though his terrible health, was ready to go for 5th term. And people said, enough, enough, enough. They went to the street. We have the Hirak. What is good about this movement, it didn't have leadership. It is unique. I think we have cross-national, participation. We have kids, we have old people, we have young, we have girls. I think it is unique. One thing. The second thing, people went to the street cross the country. I think we have at one time, 20 million people. In other words, 50% of the population were on the street. 50%. Up till now, we have, protests, every Tuesday and every Friday across, at least, 48 city. The last, even sometime we have another manifestation. Yesterday we have another manifestation about, about the oil law. The government passed a law to make a reform on the oil. Oil is the economy. It's the basic of the economy. And the problem with that, this government is not allowed to take, strategic decisions. It is illegal, and people went to the street. In other people are in the street not to get money, to get bread, no, for political reasons. And people are asking, radical change. They want, radical change, civil rule, not military. And that is, and the government and the army direction is still playing on this issue. It has organized, for the 3rd time, election on December 12. I don't know if they will take place, because people are against this election. People are not against democracy, are against election under the military. To conclude, I think the very crucial issue I think what we are witnessing, I think I would say, deep crisis of security state. Why? Because on the eve of the independence, in post-colonial society, we didn't build the nation. We built a strong, repressive state. I don't think, in most countries, we can speak of state. A state, by and large, As we can see, has Kalashnikov. State, what is a state? A lot of it is Kalashnikov, you know. We don't have state. We don't have institutions. We don't have, within state, we are very, what we call in mukhabarat or deep state, very, very profound. I think, I think it is very joke to talk about civil society, political parties. I think it is joke. Over the past 30 years, what has been the result of democratization? The power, the military power is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. We have a transfer from one type of authoritarianism to another type of authoritarianism. That is essential. We don't have a transition towards democracy. We are transition towards another type of security state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now our third speech by Dr. Tahir Kelavos about the continuity and change of Algerian regime and civil-military relations.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks for organizers for this great conference. So it's quite difficult to speak after such two esteemed professors of Algerian politics. They have explained things very well, and I'll try not to repeat, but it's also a blessing because now that they explained the civil-military relations well, I can focus more on the regime in general and talk a bit more about the recent protest, the Hirak. So I'll mostly focus on the Algerian regime during the 1990s and how they reconfigured the regime during that time and how it affects the conditions today and the protest movement today. And by doing this, I will explain the tool set of the Algerian regime to control the opposition and the people and how it tries to be still resilient. So as the professors explained, 1990s was a difficult process for Algeria with ups and downs, and that was a potential crisis for the military. And during that time, they reconfigured and diversified their tool sets to stay in power, and that worked pretty well until this point, and we'll see if it's going to work as well. But the important thing about the current protest movement, the Hirak, is to understand that tool set. Because the army, the regime is still trying to use some of the things in that tool set, so it's very important to understand that in order to understand the potentials for the success of the Hirak. So as the professors explained, the end of 1980s and beginning of 1990s was the time of an attempt of democratization in Algeria. And that was the first of its kind in the Arab world, which was very important. But it ended with a coup d'etat in early 1992. And it was followed by the so-called Black Decade, which took place between the army and the warring factions and ended with the civil concord in 1999, which started the rise of, or re-rise of, President Bouteflika. And after Bouteflika came to power in 1999, with the deals and the amnesty coming after that, with the peace accord, it, to some extent, brought stability to Algeria, and that stability became the key for to some extent, the legitimacy of the Bouteflika regime as well, that I'm going to explain. But the question is, in this process of ups and downs, with first trying to democratize and then having a coup and then having a conflict, how could the regime refound itself? First, let's zoom out from Algeria a bit and talk about the autocrats and authoritarian regimes. So, in general, the main purpose of an autocrat is to survive, is to stay in power. Unless there are certain pressures, either from the people or from inside the regime, there are not many incentives for the autocrats to democratize. Very rarely you can see some quote-unquote benevolent dictators who initiate democratization, but it is very rare. So they want to stay in power. And in order to stay in power, they use different tools, either to manipulate or control the masses and the opposition. Sometimes it is a single tool, and it is usually the repression and other forms of repression like coercion. And it is called the original sin of authoritarian regimes, because it is the first thing that comes into mind. Authoritarian regimes rule and control with a stick. So they use the military force, they use the police to control the people and the opposition. But at the same time, we can see some diversified tools as well. It is not only the repression, it's not only bullets, it's not only the baton. You can also see some other political means to control the opposition and the masses. Sometimes they use institutional mechanisms, even constitutions, to exclude the opposition, to divide and rule the opposition, to have elections but having fraud, or disenfranchise some of the people. So in a way, they give certain things to the people or the opposition, but they do it in a limited way. So on the one hand, the repression is a stick. If the repression is a stick, then these kind of tools are like carrots. So sometimes you control using a stick, but sometimes you control using a carrot. And from using only sticks to turning into usage of carrots increased a lot around the world, especially in 1980s, 90s, and the last 2 decades. In the past, authoritarian regimes were mostly what is called closed or full authoritarian regimes. They did not necessarily have elections. Some of them had opposition parties, but most of them did not have. But especially in the last couple of decades, we saw that these authoritarian regimes were liberalizing. They were opening up. So they turned into some sort of hybrid regimes with elections. But these elections are not necessarily free and fair. Some of them are free, but not fair. And in this situation, they created some new means to control the opposition as well, the carrots that I meant. And even though at first these kind of liberalizing means were seen as a first step for democratization, scholars and policymakers later realized that these are not necessarily a step for democratization. These are actually tools to survive. These are autocrats' tools to remain in power. In that sense, elections in these kind of authoritarian regimes are mostly used to control the opposition and at certain times co-opt the opposition. At the same time, it is to appease the people, just like giving them something, but not giving them everything. So this actually created a so-called trap of liberalized autocracy in the Middle East and elsewhere. And when we look at the Arab world, this actually happened as well. There are 2 waves of liberalization in the Arab world. These are some figures from different regime indicators of the Arab countries, about 15, 16 countries, from like freedom of expression, political parties, liberties, and media. As you can see, obviously going up is being more democratic or more open. As you can see, the first peak or the first uptick is in early 1990s, and the second one is in early 2010s. So in early 1990s, not just in Algeria, but in other Arab countries as well, the regimes learned to create some more openings, more space for the opposition. And they used that to remain in power, and most of them remained in power for the next 20 years. So to some extent it worked. And the second one was as a response to the Arab uprisings in early 2010. But you can see a downturn after 2013 as well. So in this lens, if you look at the Algerian regime, Algerian regime was an old school, full authoritarian regime before 1990s, but they moved to this new school hybrid authoritarian regime during the 1990s. In the past, before 1990s, the regime depended on 3 main tools, which were oil rents, legitimacy, and coercive apparatus. And when I say coercive apparatus, I talk about the army and intelligence service at the same time. But during this crisis, during this reconfiguration, they reconfigured some of these tools and initiated some new tools as well. So the regime still has the old tool, the oil rents, but they tried to reconfigure the legitimacy because, as Dr. Yahya said, the legitimacy of the regime, the liberator of the war of liberation, started to evaporate at the end of 80s. So they tried to bring the legitimacy of stability with Bouteflika, which is also evaporating today. And they reconfigured coercive apparatus, which I'm going to explain, and they brought some new tools as political reforms and multi-party system. So I'm not going to talk about the oil rents and legitimacy too much here, but looking at the other three tools. First, the coercive apparatus. As the professors explained, the army and the intelligence service have always been very important in Algeria. They controlled, they were the main decision makers with change in balance of power, but they were the main decision makers since the independence. But in especially late 1980s, there was some increase in civilian role as well. And after the democratization process, we saw the return of the army. With the coup d'etat, after the coup d'etat of 1992, the High Committee of State was founded, and that was under the influence of the army, even though there were civilians in it. That was a de facto military rule for some time. And during the civil conflict, we also saw a reinforcement of the Algerian army. Armed personnel more than doubled during this time, and the military expenditure also doubled in terms of ratio to the GDP. So the army had already been important and powerful, but it became even more powerful during that time. Dr. Rashid explained the army's involvement in business. It increased during the 90s and especially in the last 2 decades. And also we witnessed the rise of the DRS, a reconfigured version of the intelligence service becoming more powerful under the, infamous General Tawfiq. So along with the army and the intelligence service, political reforms became a very important tool for the Algerian regime for the last 2 decades. Before 1990, we barely seen reforms. There were several instances, but it wasn't that common. After that, whenever the regime saw pressure from the opposition or the people, they used political reforms to balance things out. So the initiation of political reforms became a tactic. One of the former members of parliament from one of the regime parties that I interviewed once told me that the Algerian regime responds to the demands from the people and the opposition. And we saw this in constitutional amendments in 96, 2002, 2008, 2016. So this is the mindset of the regime. People ask something and we give to them. But in reality, these constitutional amendments made minor changes. They did not change the whole scene. So they use this saying that, oh, see, we respond to the people, but in reality, they don't necessarily do that. We saw the same thing in 2011. When the Arab uprisings reached to Algeria, President Bouteflika went on TV and promised some reforms and transparency. And the regime also injected some money to the system as well. But this promise of reforms helped the regime to end the protests. The promises were realized 5 years later with a constitutional amendment, which was too far from the promised reforms. So they still use these kind of things. At the end, these reforms did not bring any genuine change, and the regime strategy to some extent worked. And then the second thing that they brought during the 1990s was the multi-party system. Because before 1989, even though there were political groups, the political parties were banned. There was no legal political party. And after the coup, rather than going back to the previous version, they kept the political parties. So at first, this can create more space for the opposition, and they can operate and they can bring change. But at the same time, the regime defined the limits of this party system and undermined the strength of the opposition to keep them under control. So there are 5 features of this Algerian multi-party system, which we can discuss more on Q&A, that the Algerian regime uses to keep them under control. First, they keep the parties very scattered. From the same ideological camps, there are multiple parties competing with each other and fighting with each other. And the regime sometimes uses this party against the party from the same ideology to balance them out. Second, there are 2 regime parties, not just one, but 2 regime-affiliated parties. So if the discontent with one of the parties increases, then the regime can circulate them and then bring the other party up front, and then it's a balancing way. Third, there are limitations. I mean, that's a general thing. And the fourth and fifth things that Dr. Rashid explained, there is fraud. It is very clear. And interestingly, there's a freedom of expression in Algeria, probably more than some other countries in the region. It is easier in Algeria to criticize the prime minister or even president, maybe not necessarily the military, but the regime is fine as long as the speech does not turn into action. And this was the case until the Hirak started. So the Hirak became a new form of challenge in this light. So this reconfiguration worked around 20 years, but now, 15, 20 years, but now there's a new challenge. There's an economic crisis, there's a legitimacy crisis, and people are suffocating. So they needed to find new ways. But this is a new form, because these are not coming from organized politics, and the parties are not as much involved. So the regime strategy was, let them speak, and we control the parties. But this is not coming from the parties, this is coming from the streets. So since it was a new form of challenge, the regime did not know how to respond at first. They were kind of dumbfounded. And I mean, like in first days of Hirak, you could see some chants about changing the whole system and democratization, but the main demand was against President Bouteflika's 5th term. And maybe at that time, if they decided not to go with Bouteflika, it would be maybe easier for the regime to stop the protest, but they didn't know what to do, and they continued, and it spiraled into an anti-Bouteflika protest, and the anti-regime demand, which were already there, became the central demand at that point. So in order to understand this, there are so many people, especially outside of Algeria, non-Algerians, and I'm one of them as well, but talking about Algerian people think this, Algerian people think that, and this happens too much in Washington, D.C. So with 2 of my colleagues, we wanted to understand what Algerians think. That's why we carried out a survey in the last couple of months. And since it is very difficult to go on the ground in Algeria right now and to do a survey and ask sensitive questions, we did an online survey, which has some downsides, but we can discuss the methodology in the Q&A. And we asked several questions about their opinions about the regime and the protest. And in this survey, we mainly targeted 2 groups. First is the protesters, and second is the military personnel. And in these results, I'm going to give you the results from protesters, non-protester civilians, and then military personnel, being soldiers, junior officers, and senior officers. When we look at the goals of the protest, majority of the protesters, 90% of the protesters, obviously believe that the protest goals are correct and they should continue, but we see similar things. Even though it's a bit less, we see similar things from the others as well. Even non-protesters support the goals of the protest. About 70% of them support. Among the military, the soldiers and the junior officers support the protest more, but we see a decline in support from the senior officers. An interesting thing that you will see throughout the graphs here, usually non-protesters and the senior officers were more or less similar to each other, and soldiers and junior officers were closer to the protesters in their opinions. Second thing, support for specific protest goals. So these results are from mid-July, and we asked them what is their opinion about Bouteflika's resignation, and the vast majority wanted Bouteflika to leave. So they were on board. But when we asked about the change of system, there were some difference between these groups. So the senior officers, about half of them did not necessarily want the change of the system, which is understandable, but the protesters want a change of system, which means they want democracy. About 80% of the protesters want a real change of the system. And when we look at what their expectations from the protest are, about 90% believe that it's going to end in democracy. Again, this was in July, maybe it declined a bit, but 90% believe that it's going to end in democracy, and not many people believe that civil war will be an outcome after this, which is important. And again, about 90% of the people, both the protesters and the others, think that a new constitution is needed in Algeria. They want a new constitution, and also they believe that the state should seize the assets of the businessmen who are corrupt. So this is very important when we consider the business connection and corruption as well. But what are the extent of the demands? So we asked about a potential prosecution of President Bouteflika after he resigned. People want him gone, but not necessarily prosecuted. About 40% wants him prosecuted, but not all of it. So probably, I mean, at least in our survey, that is the result. One interesting finding for us was the removal of Chief of Staff Gaid Salah, which was a bit lower than we expected, but again, this is from July. Maybe it increased a bit. About only 30% of the protesters want him gone, which was, I was expecting more. But in another question that we asked, actually more people are fine with him removed by the military, so they are fine with him replaced by another military officer. So finally, about civil-military relations. The people in Algeria, as the professor said, people respect the Algerian army, but there are limitations for that. They don't necessarily want the Algerian army to referee the political arena. When we look at that, about 30% is fine with Algerian army playing politics, but 70% don't want this. This is a big number. Obviously, the military wants it more, but the civilians don't necessarily want that. Also, if you see that, people are fine with Algerian military having a say on security issues. So the problem is not with the Algerian military, the problem is with the involvement of the military with the politics. And, okay, I'm gonna conclude. So, in short, the Algerian system, Algerian regime reconfigured itself in 1990s and brought some new tools, but some of these tools were not working, and this started Hirak. And during Hirak, the regime is still trying to use some of these. At the same time, they use some sort of repression. They are arresting some of the opposition politicians and protesters in the last couple of weeks and months. But at the same time, they are using some of the reforms. They are trying to prosecute some of the corrupt politicians and businessmen, and they are trying to promise some reforms, but so far none of these worked. Why? Because the reforms that the regime promised so far are mostly short-term, Band-Aid-like solutions. They did not necessarily promise democratization. There is no long-term response coming from the regime. That is why people are not accepting an election that is bringing a real democratization so far. But is that enough to convince the protesters? It's difficult to know. And actually, that probably defines the fate of the Hirak as well. I mean, the continuation of the protest is crucial for the success of Hirak, but at the same time, we have a regime that is not necessarily responding to the demands. So this is right now a chess game. On the one side, we have protesters pushing for change, but on the other hand, we have the regime and mainly the military trying to keep their authority. And which one is going to give up first? It is still unknown, but it is going to be the key. And most probably, while people are still doing this and still striving, probably the opposition should unite and try to do something at the same time, because the regime is using the opposition to end the whole process as well. So we are going to see the outcome, and we can discuss more on the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Tahir Kelavos. Now we will move to questions. We have like 30 minutes for the questions. I will start asking each speaker one question. You mentioned that we have in Algeria, like Pakistan, the narrative that democracy will not work in this country, and the military trying to have this discourse always that democracy is not working in Algeria. It's like Pakistan. So how do you think we can counter this? To Dr. Rashid Tilmsani, you mentioned that military is getting stronger every day. What are the practical steps that we can take on the ground practically to restrain this military getting strong and strong? Lastly, to Dr. Tahir, you mentioned about the authoritarian system, how they theoretically works, how they try to destroy the opposition, etc. So how they use, for example, this idea of stability to control as an excuse. So how do you think we can counter this narrative that from civil society perspective at least? Thank you. Now we will move to questions. Okay. Okay. We will start with Imad because, yeah. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for giving me space. Thank you for your provocative presentations. Many questions and ideas in my mind, but again, I will seek myself on one remark and comment, then on which I build my question. If the notion of the civil-military relation is about drawing borders between civilians and people with arms, the concept, however, differs from the Western to the MENA cases. Here I refer to Egypt and Algeria specifically. The Western cases to the civil-military concepts, approaches, and theories try to enable the military to get small space in decision-making when it comes to the national defense. But in the case of the military systems in our region, in Africa, scholars still research how to find and enable the civilian to get a place in the political military camp, especially in Algeria and Egypt. We could somehow answer a question of why states in the region are military and why the military stays still in existence through cultural many factors you mentioned even from yesterday. But we're stuck in answering the question of how we enable the civilian to have his place in politics. My question, coming back again to the question of how we do enable the civilians to take part in the state, which is the first state, many speakers mentioned different solutions, but again, are normative. For instance, sending military to retirement, who send who. Also, civil society with its peaceful and strong movement in Algeria could somehow shake the regime, but could not change it.
Okay.
Don't you think that it is necessary, even crucial, to have another power from the lamp of the military institution itself, that is the main actor holding the power? This power must have ability to change and work on shifting the power from the military to civilians, like many cases in Europe, which is the case with the common factor in the different places in the Eastern Europe. And here I could theoretically refer to Montesquieu, a quotation where he said, pour qu'on puisse abuser du pouvoir, il faut que par la disposition des choses, le pouvoir arrête le pouvoir. Means we need power that we count on to stop another power. Okay. For the last comment for Dr. Tahir, the cartoon is toolkit that proves and hypothesizes finally that military system coexists with the given environment. The toolkit that you mentioned is among many toolkits we have seen since 1962. And thank you.
Okay, so yes, here, please. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Muhammad Haroun. I'm from the University of Khartoum, Sudan. Now with the presentations we had on the cases of civilian military in in, in cases like Egypt, Pakistan, and Algeria. It looks like there are things in common. One thing in common is that it looks like the military is not just right as the center of the establishment. It's rather the establishment itself is so deep-seated in these three cases. Maybe Turkey is also a case, which we have not yet had any presentation on. In case that is the case, and together with taking into account that there are cases which are country-specific. So, given this, it looks like it's rather difficult to go for a kind of a global model of democracy. In the cases that we have been and we have just gone through, it looks like there is some kind of a marriage between the military and power, okay, which might not match with the popular multi-party model, Western style multi-party model. So is there any way that we consider thinking about what Dr. Bruce called yesterday a grand bargain, and such a deal between the civilian and the military towards seeing some kind of democratic transformation in the region at least. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please try to keep your question or comment within like 30 seconds or 1 minute so we can get more questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the panelists. I have 3 questions. The first one for Dr. Yahya is about the memory of the Black Decade. Do you think that this memory, this experience has an impact on the solution of this conflict between Iraq and the military establishment in Algeria? Do you think that maybe this memory restrain and break the violence of the military? And I have a question for Dr. Rashid. There is a link, I think, in our history between the economic crisis and the change. Every time that we had a crisis, for example, you mentioned the economic crisis during the 80s and also during the 90s, we have this kind of political liberalization. Do you think that now we are going through a crisis, economic crisis in Algeria? Do you think that the Algerian regime will behave in the same way like the past? And my last question for Dr. Taher is about in the presentation, we have the image of our Algerian army is stable. There is no change in it. So we have the same army during the revolution and after the independence and during all the Algerian history. But do you think that there is a change within the establishment? We have a new generation, educated, and this generation hasn't this revolutionary legitimacy.
Okay.
Do you think there is change, and how this change will impact the behavior of the military establishment in its behavior, with the Iraq? Thank you.
Okay. Here, Shadi. Please keep, because like 30 seconds. Because
I will give. Hello, I will keep it short, inshallah. Thank you for this great panel. It was very informative. My first question to Professor Yahya regarding the triangle that you speak about, presidency, military, and intelligence service. The case right now, as I understand it, there is no presidency, and the intelligence becomes part of the military. So I can conclude from this that the most powerful actor right now is the military, and I can expect that he has privilege in shaping the outcome of the Iraq. So do you think that the intelligence still independent? To what extent this triangle going to achieve the outcome? The second question is for Professor Tahir regarding the survey. For the senior officer's response, I would like to question, do you think those representative for the senior officers, because they are the one who is using internet, going to survey asking about Iraq, so most likely they are more democratic, more liberal, more educated. So, yani, to some extent, I think this is, to what extent do you think this is representative to the seniors? The third questions for the panelists, not specific to someone. If we compare between the Sudan and the Algerian Iraq, can we say that the Iraq right now, some of the panelists say this, one of the advantages of this Iraq, there is no leadership. So, but in Sudan, there was a leadership that negotiating with the military and reach an agreement. But right now, can we see that the Iraq is indirectly negotiating the army? But in the long run, does this survive? I'm just asking. The last question will be very short. If there is any effect in the survey or generally for what happening in Egypt for the Algerian army response to the protests, can we say that there is any effect from the Egypt? Thank you.
Okay, last question there. Yes, please. Yes. Please, 30 seconds. So.
Couple of questions for Dr. Tahir Kilawuz. I hope I didn't butcher your name too much. First of all, fantastic study, empirically rigorous, theoretically rich. I wanted to bring your, draw your attention to the classic literature on transitions in which liberalization is often a trap or a kind of slippery slope for autocrats. When they open up regimes, it's not always easy to control the pace of that. And you see this notion of resurrection of civil society, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is this authoritarian adaptation that the Algerian autocrats learned from what happened around the world? Two, have you seen any concrete evidence? I've read some news reports of whether the protesters have actually learned from the mistakes that the Egyptian protesters did by kind of focusing just on getting rid of Hosni Mubarak rather than changing the regime. Thank you.
Any question in this side? Yes, please.
My question is, considering the intelligence effect on the Algerian political life, and considering that there is no leadership, how do we expect that the Iraq is going to get any results, negotiating a very manipulating system, as Dr. Tahir explained, without having a very strict plan on how things are going to be in the future? So considering leadership, non-leadership, as a privilege is very questionable in this situation. Okay. And thank you.
Dr. Luay Safi. Dr. Luay Safi.
My question is about the economic role of the military. I heard some of you mentioning that. But I'm interested particularly in knowing whether there is anything like what happened in Pakistan, the Pakistani army and the Egyptian army trying to cater for the need of particular segment of the society by providing sort of colonies or isolated residencies with universities and access to some services that the rest of the population doesn't have.
Yes, a short question. Why Abdulaziz Bouteflika was successful in putting an end to the violence in Algeria and not Al-Shazali bin Jadid? Because I listened directly to Al-Shazali bin Jadid much earlier on on his ideas, before he submitted his resignation, his ideas on accommodating Islamists in the political system of the country. And he elaborated so much on that. That is during the early days of the Kuwaiti Iraqi crisis, and we were in Wahran, and he was giving us his thoughts about the problem in Algeria, and his thought and hopes that the Islamists will be accommodated and the problems of the violence in the country will be ended much earlier than Bouteflika's later attempts to put an end to it. Thank you.
I have a short question for the panel. It's a wonderful panel, and I enjoyed it. My name is Ali Abu Zahouk. I'm from Libya, so your neighbor. My question is that the Algerian movement here is not working in a vacuum. In the 90s, France and others interfered with the army, with the generals, to turn the democratic experience. Today, do you think that the army is working on its own, or there is other forces that are interfering to stop the Hirak from being a genuine movement for democracy in Algeria?
Okay, this is the last question because we have like
Dr.
12 minutes.
Dr. Yahya mentioned that there is a deep state in Algeria. Has it run out of options to finding a solution to this crisis, or has it become tainted too much that it cannot now allow the state to get out of this situation?
So you have a lot of questions now. I give you 3 to 4 minutes, to Tahir 2 minutes, because your presentation was longer. So yes, please.
I'll start with the last one regarding the deep state. I have to be honest, I don't know. Why? Because it's so murky right now. There are different forces at play. We were having breakfast this morning. What is the role of the intelligence services? They are out of the picture, openly, but they are behind the scenes. You can see, you can decipher or decode some of the media that he talked about, because behind the media there are forces involved in it. So we don't know. But I think the deep state is the one that let go of Bouteflika. That we can say for sure. But how they are going to react to the Hirak, we don't know. We'll see with how the movement is progressing. Foreign interference, I start from the last one because they're fresher in my mind. Foreign interference, the only ones who are trying to interfere, and the Hirak is very fully aware and has rejected them, are the UAE. These are the ones who are the target of the demonstrators, because they know, Algerians know very well, the street knows, Hirak knows, that these are the two anti-revolutionary forces, that is the Saudis and the UAE. So it's very clear. They're even showing, mocking Gaid Saleh dressed in a UAE, but Dashdasha and all that stuff. So people are very much aware. So, and the French have been very careful. The neighbors, the immediate neighbors, that one guy, former minister in Morocco, has resigned because the king reacted very badly to one of his statements. So everybody is aware. The Algerians, if you look at all the slogans, which is a study in itself, if I was a doctoral student, this is what I would do. And they are sending clear messages to the United States, to the French. They say, Macron, deal with your wife. They were making a mockery of that. For Trump, they said, we'll sell you olive oil, but don't touch our oil, and so on. So it's very interesting. So foreign interference, I think foreigners better not try to interfere in Algeria's. In fact, they are even accusing, the movement is accusing the leaders, the current leaders, of being in cahoots with foreign powers. So, and I'm sure it's going to create some unease within the armed forces, especially the lower ranks that Tahir was talking about, because they are very much, very proud, very nationalistic, and very professional. How the Hirak will get around the leadership? Both he and I agree we don't care about leadership right now, because the regime is very good at co-opting any leader that may emerge. So the messages are going straight. It's communication between the street, the Hirak, and the current rulers. So it's very clear. Yes, there is a sort of two radical positions, and we'll see how it will unfold eventually. But anyone that appeared, the cleanest people, the reformers, the ones who are pushing for democracy and so on, are staying now, have withdrawn from any, like Rahabi and so on. They said, whoop, because anybody right now who gets involved on the side of the regime, even to negotiate, is excluded because they see them as being co-opted by the regime. So I'm not worried about the lack of leadership. The movement knows what it wants. It has kept the Silmiya to remain peaceful. And I don't know if I think someone had asked the question. The protest movement has learned from the past experience. This is why they don't go to violence. Violence would have been beneficial. I was myself writing on Facebook, do not, we are many Algerians, who are talking on Facebook, do not fall into the trap of going into violence, because the former regime wanted the violence. And I'll link this to the question regarding the military. The reason why everything collapsed in the Bouteflika regime is that the military clearly was not going to shoot at the population. This is very clear. The military made it very clear that it would not intervene against the population. This is what the lesson that the military learned from 1988. Maybe we did not state it, but in 88, the military, which had this great image among the population, this popular army has shot its own children, just like the colonial forces. So it took many years before the military regained this image of a popular force that is on the side of the people. So the military has learned the lesson, and the high command is fully aware that it cannot trust the lower ranks, because they would not shoot at the people. So both the military and the Hirak have learned their lesson. To get back to your question, I think I'll leave the others to. What is your question? I'm sorry, I have it
about
here.
the narrative, about
The narrative. The narrative, I think, is eroded as well. It was right after independence. They had the image of the nationalist movement that was divided. And so the FLN intervened and said, basta, it's only one party, all the other parties are excluded. So if they want, they can join the FLN as individuals, not even as parties. That was very clear. So it remained for a while. Democracy is not good, and even the events of 2011 were a conspiracy. I interviewed the Prime Minister of Algeria when he was in office, and he was telling me, all this movement, is from, that's basic. But it doesn't work anymore because it's coming genuinely from the Hirak, from the population. Somebody asked me about the structure. Right now, it's murky. You don't know. Yes, it seems that the high command is in power, but what is happening with the deep state, with the intelligence services? Believe me, they are not in the picture, but they have not disappeared. So, but again, I have to be honest with you. We don't have. One of the aspects, the more, everybody is aware of that, any specialist of Algeria, the system is very opaque. You don't know what really goes on within the system, let alone within the deep state. But I think the deep state will eventually have to make concessions and agree to a transition, whatever it is. When I was writing in the 90s on Algeria, the failure of the transition in the 90s was the lack of a negotiated pact at that time. The regime could have had it. But I think without, and again, I'm open to criticism, I think the FIS screwed up the whole process, because the FIS came with no negotiation. It wanted regime change and opposed even the other forces. And the Muslim Brotherhood was in a tough situation. I was friends with Mahfoud Mahna, Allah yarhamhu. You know, he was telling me, they're killing even my own people. They're killing the Muslim Brotherhood, you know? So whatever hope there was for a negotiated transition did not happen. So that is my answer to you. I think I should let the others
Thank you
have
very
their own.
much, Dr. Rashid.
Thank you very much. I like it very much your the questions. You know, to save my time, you know, I am not going to repeat what my friend said. You know, okay. I said, you know, Zubir has already responded to some questions. You know, so to save some time, I will focus on some questions. The first one, it is a really running question. It was asked yesterday by the president of one panel and also the actual president, you know, said, you know, what are the practical step that we have to do further? I think this question is a theoretical question. We cannot build same strategy with you if we don't have the same understanding of the situation. We cannot build the same strategy if your project is different from mine. For instance, I like to build, you know, Islamic, you know, state, and you have, you know, secular state. We have nothing in common. I am sorry, because our understanding, our situation are different. So I think we should understand really in objective way and scientific way the whole issue. What is the background and how the civil, military, and power relationship have been developed in our countries. And here we have to come back to the deep state. What is the relationship between democratization, civil society, and deep state? Why democratization has failed over 30 years? Why? What is deep connections? And what is the relationship with deep state and foreign players? But too bad the people, our scholars, do not raise these questions. Because scholarship is based on law journalism. That is a question. The teaching has been very low. And the first crisis about the education. Myself, you know, when I see, you know, professors of big universities, you know, repeat what journalists, you know, have said on very complicated and complex issue, I think it is really terrible. We should, first of all, and I hope this center we develop a kind of theoretical, you know, project to bring graduate students, you know, to develop this issue. It is already theoretical, and we have to understand. To understand our society, we have to build our own theory. We shouldn't wait from New York or whatever to bring in a theory to explain what is going on. These people, they come here in big hotel, they stay a few days, and then they write books, you know, then they said their recommendation to our, you know, rulers, and they take, you know, strong decisions. I think we have to tackle this crucial issue. The second question is, you know, about the economic crisis that we are facing now. Is some relationship with the past has for the political situation? I think we are living two different situations, two different, you know, historical contexts. We cannot have the same tools. It's quite different, you know, from population, from, you know, constraint, from the globalization, and so on. We have to understand the situation is evolving quickly, and we, in a third world, in Muslim side, we stay stuck in the old-fashioned, in the old concepts. We have to do our own, you know, theoretical revolution, you know. I think we have to do it. Otherwise, you know, we cannot understand, we cannot be decision makers in our own destiny. I think we have to be very cautious about that. Another question about the comparison between the Sudan and the Algerian Iraq. I think there is a very important difference. The Sudan has, relatively speaking, strong civil society. Algeria doesn't have this civil society. The Sudan has struggled over the past 10 years, 20 years to build this kind of society. And it is background of the old elite. The old elite in the Sudan in the 70s and 80s, they went to jails and they have, Marxists and very scientific, background, they taught to the young generation how to build a civil society. And the civil society, in Sudan, in comparison to Algeria, is relatively, stronger. And it has, on leadership, they were able to discuss kind and transition with the military establishment.
Bouteflika destroyed civil society in Algeria.
Yeah, about the Hirak, the background. The Hirak, it is the result of the long process of struggles. In Algeria, we have strike, over 30 years, From in 2010, according to the official, statistics, we had, 10,000 strikes 1 year. I think in every corner in Algeria, we have strike, we have violence, we have, the disturb, the issue. So the hierarchy, it is a consecration of long process. And that is what is going on in the Arab world. And Iraq, that's my strong theoretical argument, which is the second wave of the Arab Spring. That is the crucial issue, and Iraq learned from the past experience. Now I think we have in Sudan, we have in many countries, even though in Africa we have to take close look to Africa. What is going on? A lot of things, We shouldn't concentrate to build up our bases on Arab world and Muslim world. We have strategic dimension on Africa, from history, from culture, from our struggle, and so on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Last words.
Okay, I'm going to try to cover very quickly. First, let me tell you some stuff about the survey, and it can be an answer for Ustad Ahmed's question as well. So today, if we try to work with an Algerian survey agency and let their enumerators to go to street and ask these questions, probably they're going to get arrested. So it was not possible to do that on the street. That's why we tried an online survey, which has certain downturns, because you cannot have a real representative online survey. You have to give up on something. So we could ask more sensitive questions and we could reach out to Algerians, but it is not entirely representative. We used Facebook advertisement to target people. It's not like the classical Facebook yes and no survey. Like we just use advertisement to direct people to our survey. And we did some checks. Luckily, we don't have any bots, but there are some concerns about it. What we tried is to get certain representativeness in terms of age, gender, and education, and we more or less got that. But we cannot have an ideological distribution, those kind of stuff. When it comes to military officers, we depend on their own self-reporting. So we ask whether they are belonging to military, and we are asking their ranks. So when they say senior officers, we think they are senior officers, we cannot prove it. So we cannot know how representative it is. But, I mean, probably all senior officers use some sort of internet. So we hope it is to some extent representative, but we cannot know how much. And in relation to that, Dr. Hawas, clearly there is a change in the establishment of the army throughout time. The thing that did not necessarily change is that army does not want to leave power. Of course, the personnel is changing, the people are changing, and the different groups are changing. Like even in early 1990s, late 1980s, there was a gap between the senior officers and junior officers. Junior officers want to change more than the senior officers. And we are seeing the same thing today as well, as Dr. Yahya explained. About Dr. Akil's question about liberalization being a slippery slope. So yes, I mean, like liberalization led to democratization, especially in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. So it is correct that in certain places, liberalization was the first step for democratization. But actually, in another research that I had, I tested this across different regions. And we see that this argument about liberalization leading to democratization is working during the third wave, and especially in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, not necessarily in other regions. And specifically in the Middle East, the direction of the effect is on the opposite direction. In the Middle East, liberalization leads to the survival of authoritarian regimes more than any other region. So it is a slippery slope, but somehow it worked. And probably they are learning from other authoritarians as well. I don't know necessarily in 1990s that they learned from others, but there is a literature about authoritarian learning as well, which I'm sure you know, that like authoritarian leaders are copycatting from each other as well. So that's happening too. Whether protesters learned from the others, so I cannot prove because we don't have a direct question about it. But as Dr. Yahya said, we can use certain things because we asked their expectations about the protest and asked like whether they end up as Tunisia or Egypt, but well, Algerians like to be the Algerians, so they said, no, we are going to be Algerian, we are going to be different, not going to be like that. And we also asked how the protest should pursue, like protesters pursue as a strategy, whether they want more violent strategies or non-violent strategies. And we asked this question about a month ago, so later in the protest movement, and we gave different strategies and asked them to rank from 1 to 4. So these are the results. For continuation of protest, peaceful protest, it is 2.9 out of 4. For sit-in and strikes, it is about 1.5. For civil disobedience, Isyan Medani, I'm still not sure what exactly it is because it's a vague term, but it is about 1. And now coming to the violent strategies, right, taking over some private properties and government buildings or attacking security forces is 0.1 out of 4. So that probably shows that they learned from other experiences and try to keep it on the peaceful side. So yeah, let me leave it here because Dr. Fadi is...
So if you still have a question, our guests are at our campus today and tomorrow. Thank you for Dr. Yahya Zubair. Thank you for Rashid Telmisani and Tahir Kelavos. This was a very clear presentations, and we have a lot of idea about the relationship between military, etc. in Algeria. By this, I conclude and give Dr. Abdulrahman Maqdad the word.
First, I'd like to welcome our rector, Dr. Mehmet Balut. Thank you very much for joining us. He was supposed to be with us yesterday, but I told you that he couldn't for personal and family reasons, but we're happy that he is with us today. Abdulrahman.
Right, thank you very much for our panelists. We'd like to hand out the certificates. Dr. Sami, please. Dr. Yahya. Dr. Rashid. Rashid, عفوا. Dr. Rashid. Dr. Tahir. And finally, our own Fadi Zatari. All right, thank you very much, everybody. We will break for lunch. Okay, so we will break until 3, and we will be back for our last session.